Sometimes it's hard to keep your emotions in check, especially when events keep happening over the course of several years that throw you off track. But can a carefully planned murder be considered a loss of control? Joanna Simpson was born in 1964. Her wealthy family lived in Yorkshire, UK, where she spent most of her childhood. Joanna attended an all-girls primary school and completed several grades before the family decided to relocate. The Simpsons moved to Laxey on the Isle of Man after her father sold his construction company. After graduating from the local school, Joanna attended Oxford High School and then studied business administration at university. She was quite popular among her peers. Joanna was a well-mannered, friendly, and optimistic girl who liked to help everyone she got along with. This attracted people, so she was always surrounded by a lively group of classmates. They enjoyed spending time with her. Of course, there were also young men in this group who were hoping for her attention. Nevertheless, Joanna was focused on her work and career and wanted to establish a secure life before starting a family. She decided to get married in 1994 when she turned 30. Her husband also came from a wealthy family. Joanna and her husband bought a huge house in Ascot. It was in a dilapidated state and needed renovations to make it livable. At the time, the couple had no children, so choosing such a large house seemed excessive to some. They lived just the two of them near Windsor, home to the royal family castle. Legoland was also nearby, so their chosen location seemed like a good option for expanding the family. However, Joanna was in no hurry to do so. She planned to convert part of the house into a guest house so that relatives and friends could visit more often. Her husband supported her but also wanted to have children. It seemed like a loving relationship, but after 3 years of marriage, her husband decided to separate from her. It seemed as if this was all due to her lack of desire to have children. Joanna was devastated by this decision. Her friends, noticing how depressed she was, wanted to help her. One of her close friends was working as a senior flight attendant at the time. She had a flight planned to South Africa. The young woman suggested that her friend fly with her, hoping that a change of scenery would help her recover, and she agreed. As it turned out, this decision was fateful because during the flight, Joanna met a man named Robert Brown. He was a pilot for British Airways and was flying the plane she and her friend were traveling on. The man loved running and was a 3-time British cross-country champion, something he was very proud of. They seemed to have a lot in common, and so a romantic relationship began. Joanna retained the right to the house from her first marriage, as she had invested a large portion of the funds in it. Shortly after returning from Africa, she and her new lover moved in together. As early as September 1998, they began thinking about marriage. The man proposed at Christmas. Everything happened very quickly. Joanna was usually much more cautious, but not this time. After their engagement in February 1999, they exchanged vows. This haste surprised many, even the young woman's parents, who had only seen Robert a few times up to that point. The man did not make a good impression on them. They considered him too arrogant and believed he was incapable of giving their daughter love. However, it was pointless to try to dissuade Joanna. She was independent and old enough to make such decisions. The only thing the young woman's parents could do was persuade her to draw up a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. The Simpsons believed this relationship could end quickly and did not want their daughter to worry about divorce and risk losing part of their fortune. Just over 20 people attended the wedding. The newlyweds didn't want to draw too much attention to themselves or have an overly pompous celebration. After the ceremony, the couple immediately traveled to the country where they had met South Africa. Joanna hoped to spend an unforgettable honeymoon there, but within the first few days of the trip, she began to doubt the correctness of her decision. Robert behaved so arrogantly toward the hotel staff that she herself felt uncomfortable. Until that moment, she had never experienced such rude behavior from her lover. Even before returning from her honeymoon, Joanna called her mother and expressed her concerns that she was doubting her decision. Realizing that she hadn't gotten to know Robert well enough, Joanna watched with horror as she observed her husband's behavior during the honeymoon. She feared that his rudeness would soon be directed at her as well. Although Joanna considered her decision a mistake, the young woman did not separate from Robert immediately upon returning from South Africa. Instead, the thought occurred to her that she could change this man. This decision was likely related to the pregnancy Joanna discovered upon her return. Like most women, she thought that the birth of the child would help her husband become more attentive and caring when he became a father. However, Robert seemed determined to dash her best hopes. Instead of softening when he learned that his wife was pregnant and that she would find it difficult to leave him, he became even more rude and arrogant. His behavior now also extended to her family and friends. Nevertheless, Joanna did not want a divorce, fearing that the child would have no father, which would pose a major problem. When Alex was born, the situation changed little. A few months later, Joanna became pregnant again, and Katie was born, but the second child also had no effect on Robert's behavior. However, he did not physically harm his wife at that time, which may have also prevented the couple from separating. But all of her relatives and friends noticed how much he traumatized her psychologically. The man was extremely toxic and rude to her relatives and friends. Everyone saw how much this hurt Joanna. The longer they were together, the more obvious the difference between these people became. It was so obvious they were so different that they shouldn't be together at all. Joanna herself was aware of this, but the children prevented her from separating. After the birth of her first child, she repeatedly declared that the marriage would eventually break down and divorce was inevitable. She held on as long as she could, but after 8 years, she realized it couldn't go on. She made the final decision after her husband shared his dark thoughts with her. He had considered killing her and the children with an axe, and then taking his own life in an airplane. The woman was very frightened and filed for divorce in 2007. From that moment on, Robert's behavior deteriorated even further. He began to openly express how much he hated their relatives and his wife. He also began to manipulate her, hinting that he might take his own life. When that didn't work, he began to subtly hint that he might harm Joanna and her children. The woman didn't even know whether to take his words seriously or whether they were just attempts at manipulation. She believed that Robert had made it all up so that she would withdraw the divorce. The husband told his friends that he didn't want to increase the distance between himself and his children. Due to his job, which involved air travel, he was often abroad for several weeks and had very little time for his children. Despite Robert's negative attitude towards the separation, he was unable to change his behavior in order to convince Joanna to reconsider her decision to divorce. For the first few months after filing for divorce, they lived together. However, something suddenly happened that convinced them of the correctness of their decision. One evening, after the couple had put the children to bed, another argument broke out between them. Robert accused his wife of cheating on him, but this was untrue. Such accusations regularly came from his mouth, but they were always unfounded, as Joanna devoted herself entirely to her children. She didn't even have time to find another man or have affairs. The woman tried to justify herself, but it seemed pointless. The argument took place in the kitchen. At one point, Robert grabbed a knife, approached her, pressed the blade to her throat, and declared that he was going to kill her. Although the situation was critical, the victim of the aggression remained calm. In a calm voice, Joanna explained that there was no point in killing her, as her husband knew very well what a good mother she was. If he killed her, he would deprive the children of both their parents. Joanna emphasized that if Robert were to commit a spontaneous act of violence, he would hardly be able to avoid prison. Finally, They managed to convince the domestic tyrant to put down the knife. The very day after the incident, Joanna told her mother and some friends everything. Everyone agreed that she absolutely had to report the incident to the police, as such things could not be ignored. Everyone had noticed that Robert's behavior had become erratic and dangerous since filing for divorce. The woman feared that an arrest could have a very negative impact on the children and did not want to subject them to this stress. Joanna believed that the situation would resolve itself, as after this outburst of aggression, she had spoken to her husband again and made it clear to him that there could be no resumption of the relationship, after which he had accepted it. Joanna now begged Robert to move out of their house, as she believed that continuing to live together could be dangerous for everyone. Unfortunately, this had no effect on the husband. He declared that he had no intention of moving. The husband enjoyed living in a large house and leading a luxurious life. He was then offered money to buy an apartment, but he remained firm. Many believed he was waiting for a better financial offer, as Joanna came from a wealthy family. He was offered increasingly larger sums several times in a row. Finally, it worked, and Robert moved out. Joanna could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She no longer felt her safety threatened. The couple shared custody of the children. The wife was waiting for the divorce to be finalized when a heated argument suddenly erupted over the division of the house. Despite the prenuptial agreement, Robert had no intention of relinquishing his property. Unfortunately, the former spouses were forced to maintain contact to coordinate visits with their son and daughter. Joanna tried by all means to show that a resumption of her relationship with Robert was out of the question, so that he wouldn't try to woo her. It seemed to work. They lived separately. Robert even began a relationship with another woman, a flight attendant from his work. Sometime after the relationship began, she became pregnant. Joanna considered this good news and hoped that the relationship with another woman and her pregnancy would make Robert forget her. But she was very wrong. On November 1, 2010, a man contacted the local police station. From the beginning, he behaved very secretively, not wanting to say too much, but giving a veiled account of an incident. He chose his words carefully but still wanted to come to the police station to report something that had happened shortly before that day. He categorically refused to allow the police to come to his home, claiming to have children to care for and not wanting to cause them any unnecessary inconvenience. The suspect introduced himself as Robert Brown. Around the same time the man contacted the police, a close friend of Joanna's received a call from the school her children attended. This happened on the same day Robert contacted the authorities. Joanna's children were absent from school, and their teachers tried to call their mother to find out the reason, but no one responded. They then reached their friend, but she did not know exactly where Joanna was. The October holidays had just ended in English schools, and pupils were staying home for a week. Alex and Katie were spending this time with their biological father. Joanna was planning to fly to the Isle of Man to visit her parents, so it was unclear when the woman had disappeared. What had happened to the children? They were 8 and 9 years old, so everyone was worried. After the call from the school, Joanna's friend contacted her mother. The woman explained that her daughter was due to return to Ascot after her trip to the Isle of Man. She hadn't spoken to her on the day of her return, but after the call, the mother became anxious and tried to reach her daughter. To her horror, she received no response. Afterward, she called her friend again. Unable to locate Joanna, they decided to contact the police. By that time, Robert had already requested a meeting with the police. After comparing these two statements, the investigators decided to go to the missing woman's house to verify their worst fears. There was no one there, and no one responded to the persistent knocking, so the police officers decided to break down the door to gain entry. Once inside, they immediately noticed suspicious stains in the hallway that looked like blood. The search yielded no results. Joanna was not found, There was no one in the house at all, including the children. The police officers had to return to the station empty-handed. Now they waited for Robert to show up for the agreed meeting. When the man arrived, however, he refused to answer the police's questions about his wife. His behavior seemed very strange. He was the one who had called the police and requested a meeting, but now he refused to provide any information. Since Joanna was still missing, it was decided to arrest Robert. They decided to conduct a more thorough search of the missing woman's house, which was located on a fairly large property. As long as what had happened remained a mystery, they hesitated to press charges against the man. The authorities began to examine the entire property and, at the same time, spoke with Joanna's family members. Everyone stated that the woman could not have disappeared spontaneously and had no intention of leaving and taking her children with her. However, all of the missing woman's relatives spoke negatively about Robert and believed that only he could have had anything to do with Joanna's disappearance. On the first day of the search, the only information that could be confirmed was that Robert had taken the children to his brother's house. The missing people's relatives were at least reassured by the fact that Alex and Katie were safe. On November 2, 2010, Robert was interrogated again. Each time, they attempted to question him about the events of October 31, but to almost all questions, he replied, "No comment." The police then decided to change their tactics and talk to the man about everyday things. He immediately became animated and readily explained how much he enjoyed jogging. But as soon as the subject turned to Joanna, he became withdrawn and nervous. The man spoke quite openly about his relationship and married life with this woman, but emphasized how bad she was, called her a spoiled child, and tried by all means to portray her in a negative light. He constantly mentioned that Joanna and her family had no money problems and did not know how difficult it was to earn money. At the end of this conversation, the police had the impression that he only hated them because the Simpsons were richer than him. Robert himself came from a humble family living in Edinburgh. His father worked at the port, and his mother was a bank clerk. They didn't have major financial problems and could easily make a living, but they were far from the financial prosperity of Joanna's family. Robert himself was a pilot and earned about $150,000 a year, so he had no particular reason to complain. Nevertheless, he continued to express his dissatisfaction with all of this. The investigators talked with Robert for quite a long time about abstract topics. The man was very talkative, but when asked about Joanna and the events of October 31, he again replied that he didn't want to comment on them. To the investigators' surprise, Robert explained that he felt a kind of blockage, as if his mind prevented him from answering such questions. No matter how hard the investigators tried to get the man to talk, they were unsuccessful. The police were forced to continue gathering information. Joanna's house was thoroughly searched, and more blood was found in the living room, as well as in several places in the courtyard and on the driveway. The traces looked as if she had been taken somewhere. All of these samples were collected for analysis. It was later confirmed that the blood was Joanna's. Authorities suspected Robert had killed his ex-wife, but it remained a mystery why he had decided to commit this act 3 years after their separation. He had already begun to build a new life with another woman. However, the man himself provided a possible motive. It was clear that Joanna's wealth bothered him greatly. He had signed a prenuptial agreement, which theoretically meant that his wife's financial well-being was none of his business. After the divorce, he was entitled to nothing. As it turned out, Joanna wasn't particularly open about her family's finances. Even after the couple separated and Robert moved out, he often returned to her apartment when she wasn't there. He even persuaded his children to give him the new security code for the alarm system, which gave him unfettered access. As it turned out, his main interest was in his ex-wife's documents related to the Simpsons and their own finances. He was obsessed with the idea that Joanna had vast sums of money in various accounts. At times, His fantasies drove him to the absurd. Robert was convinced she owned up to $25 million, to which he would have been entitled without the prenuptial agreement. For a long time, prenuptial agreements were ignored in the British legal system, and court cases ensued. But since October 20, 2010, prenuptial agreements have been recognized without any additional bureaucratic hurdles. Thus, in the event of a divorce, Robert had no claim to a single cent of his wife's assets, and he knew it. Interestingly, the next court hearing in the divorce proceedings was scheduled for November 8 of that year. And now, it was highly likely that this would be their last meeting, after which the marriage would be definitively dissolved. This could be a sufficient explanation for why Robert had decided to kill his wife a week before these events. Alex and Katie were spending the entire vacation with their father. On Sunday, October 31, he was supposed to return them to their mother. Joanna was preparing for the return of her son and daughter, as she hadn't seen them in a long time and missed them, so she baked a chocolate cake and cooked her favorite meal. The woman asked one of her friends to join her for this impromptu feast. Joanna usually invited someone at such times, as she was afraid of her ex, but this time her friend couldn't make it, so she had to welcome Alex and Katie alone. The police spoke with the children. They provided valuable information that clarified all questions. The argument between the parents began immediately when Robert took Alex and Katie to their mother around 4 p.m. They were in another room and couldn't confirm exactly what was going on, but they heard noises that sounded like physical violence. According to the children, it sounded like dull thuds. After a while, the suspicious noises stopped, and Robert carried Joanna out of the room and placed her in the trunk of his car. The father told his children that their mother had fallen and was injured, and that he needed to take her to the hospital. After closing the trunk, the man ordered the children to get into the car and drove them to his home, where they stayed with his new girlfriend. After leaving them there, Robert left immediately and didn't return until around 7 p.m. When he returned home, Joanna was gone. He answered all the children's questions evasively. Robert had about 3 hours, but what he had been doing and where Joanna was remained a mystery. Robert was then questioned again, but he always gave the same answers. He was interrogated 9 times in total, but during each questioning, the man made no mention of October 31 and the events surrounding his ex-wife. After the last questioning, he asked to speak privately with his lawyer. They both went into a separate room. After about 20 minutes, the defense attorney returned and read a statement in which Robert confessed to murdering his ex-wife. The man stated that he and Joanna had argued about something related to their children's education, and at some point he lost control. He only remembered hitting his wife several times. He then wanted to take his children home and drive his wife to the hospital, but after taking the children away, the man discovered that Joanna was already dead. The man panicked and decided to dispose of the body, which he hid in the woods. The man's story sounded unbelievable. After all, Robert could have taken his wife to the hospital immediately. It also remained unclear why he had hidden her in the trunk. Why hadn't he put Joanna in the interior? It seemed as if Robert had known from the beginning that the woman was dead, and therefore, not wanting to frighten the children with the sight of their mother, hide her in the trunk. The man then agreed to lead investigators to the location where she was. The body of the 46-year-old mother of 2 was indeed found at the specified location. It was obvious that without Robert's confession, it would have been virtually impossible to find the body. He had prepared very well. He had taken Joanna more than 2 kilometers from the nearest road into dense bushes. There, Robert had dug a fairly deep hole, which he then carefully leveled and covered with leaves, as if nothing had happened. It was a truly deep pit, which is why the police didn't believe Robert. There was no sign of freshly excavated earth. It was estimated that he had removed about 400 kilograms of earth in advance, which must have taken a considerable amount of time. The ground was already frozen, making digging even more difficult. It seemed unlikely that all this could have been accomplished in 3 hours. Since there were no signs of digging, it was assumed that he had disposed of the earth elsewhere. The circumstances suggested that he had dug the deep hole in advance. The theory of careful preparation for the murder was later confirmed. The children went to this spot to lay flowers in memory of their mother. They stated that they knew the area well. They even had a secret hiding place nearby. The last time they were here was during the holidays, when they visited their father. He had probably started digging the hole for his ex-wife at that very moment, while the children were playing in their hiding place. Of course, Robert continued to deny that Joanna's murder was carefully planned. He claimed the attack was an accident. He simply lost control due to the stress that had built up during the long and difficult divorce. His lawyer insisted the crime was committed in the heat of the moment, so Robert was entitled to a lenient sentence. The forensic examination revealed that Joanna had received at least 14 blows to the head with a blunt instrument. This involved a hammer with a nail puller, which was found in the same container where the body was hidden. If Robert hadn't planned the crime, why did he bring it to the house? Robert later explained that he had taken the hammer from his shed and hidden it in his daughter's bag, but he couldn't explain why he had done so. In addition, the container contained many other items that supported the theory of a planned crime. A protective suit, plastic overshoes, and rubber gloves were found inside. After the murder, he took the surveillance camera from the house and the hammer and disposed of both. It was obvious that he had carefully prepared and acted rationally before the crime. The murder trial began in May 2011. The prosecution insisted that Joanna was the victim of a carefully planned crime. The defense argued that their client had suffered for years living with a wealthy, arrogant woman who completely controlled him. Robert complained that he had been forced to sign a prenuptial agreement. He explained that this was an attempt to take the money he believed the Simpsons owed him for the years of humiliation he had suffered during their marriage. In a moment, he lost his temper and killed his wife in a fit of rage. When the jury returned with their verdict, they shocked everyone. They found Robert guilty of manslaughter. Instead of receiving a life sentence, the murderer got off with 26 years. 2 of those years were for obstructing the investigation. Under British law, the man would have had to spend 13 years behind bars, with the remainder under police supervision. Robert could have been released in November 2023, but the outraged parents of the murdered woman could not allow that to happen. They spent years campaigning for reform of existing laws on murder and domestic violence. The commission ruled that Robert Brown posed a danger to society, which automatically deprived him of the possibility of release after serving half his sentence. The perpetrator appealed, but his appeal was rejected. He is still behind bars. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.